So tonight we go back into our Living Theosophy series. This one, of course, on the Mahatmas, the Masters. The first two times that we have had our sessions together have dealt with the Mahatmas themselves. So the personages or the aspects of the beings that we call the Mahatmas or the Masters. So, during that time we had a chance to talk about, who and what a Mahatma is, how they have actually described themselves, and their capacities and their function and their desires, I guess, for humankind. So that's the part that we have been talking about up until now. Tonight we really want to talk a little bit about the actual reason, I guess, that we know anything about the Mahatmas. Because obviously the point of their making their work known to the Western public during the late 1800s was not so that they could make it onto the pages of the Inquirer, or so that they could be more known and, for the aspect of celebrity. Obviously that was not their concern. And in fact, they regarded the sort of celebrity which they came to be regarded at that time as really sort of a distraction, and in some ways they felt that in a way it was an error that was made. That their names and the personalities that people tried to assign to them became the subject of so much thought and conversation that they felt that in many ways it became quite distractive from the reason that they had made themselves known in the first place. And that reason was certainly so that they could bring to the attention of the Western world. And, we often tend to focus on what they brought to the West, but a large part of what they were seeking to do as well with the formation of the Theosophical Society was not just to open the minds and sort of redirect the attention of people in the West, but it was also because many of the sort of Eastern approaches to spirituality had degraded also. It was not, part of the work that particularly Olcott was involved with was the restoration of Buddhism, which had kind of fallen into a state of misunderstanding, again, confusion, largely as a result of the strong missionary impulse, the Christian missionary impulse in, at that time, Ceylon, but also in India. The fact that this was a nation that was under British rule at the time, and their traditional values were largely being undermined, there was a need to kind of restore the awareness of the deeper meaning of the religions that had been the spiritual tradition of India for thousands of years. So that was sort of the point. The point was not the personality. The point was the new sort of knowledge that they were bringing. And part of that knowledge, of course, involved the Mahatmas, not as personalities, but the Mahatmas as one fact of this greater evolutionary pattern in which all of humanity is involved. So the idea that there is this sort of a progressive unfoldment that is the process that all of us are going through, and that it leads to a certain state, and that the highest sort of achievement of the human being is to move to that next step, which actually takes us in a way beyond the level of mere humanity. And that we describe as the Mahatmas, or the masters. So, I mean, that was one point that was brought out by the sort of teachings that they gave. But really, the scope of the knowledge that was imparted as a result of this sort of opening that took place was vast. And it's something that still has not been fully absorbed. So a lot of it was given. A lot of this information that we take as the sort of foundational teachings of theosophy was given out in the form of letters. The most particular of these letters we know as the book, the Mahatma Letters, which is this relatively large book, Mahatma Letters to A.P. Sinnett. And the reason why we have this, really it was never intended that the letters that they sent, which were largely a series of answers to questions that were posed by this particular Englishman, A.P. Sinnett, where through Madame Blavatsky, HPB, at one point she was talking about the teachings of the masters, and they were trying to interest British people who were active in India in this sort of teaching and in the Mahatmas. And she was talking about the Mahatmas, and she managed to impress a number of people, A.P. Sinnett being one of them, with the scope of the knowledge that she had, and also with the sort of phenomena that she was able to produce that caught a lot of people's attentions. But at one point, Sinnett asked if it would be possible for him to actually get in touch with these Mahatmas, if she could in some way be the courier for a letter in which he would ask some questions to try and further his understanding about all of these deep things that HPB had been talking about. And she said, "I'll try." And so the result of that was this sort of correspondence that took place, a lot of it in very phenomenal ways, but a correspondence that took place over a period of 6 years, from 1880 to 1886. And we are very fortunate in that the letters which A.P. Sinnett received, he kept. I mean, a lot of us get letters and then we sort of stuff them in the drawer. And then, you find you move from one house to another, and next thing you know, those letters, who knows where they are. But he felt there was a great importance in the sort of information that he was being given. So he kept them all. Or we can't say he kept them all, but he kept 145 of them over this period. And the scope of these letters, the subject matter that they covered, I mean, just to give you an example, open to the index. And, you can really pick any letter that you want. This one happens to open to M. So, I mean, you have an idea. That's just the M's. So, there's motion in terms of atoms, phases, the causes of motion, the motions that govern nature. There's motive, the adepts and how they judge men by that. There's the occult mottos, Mozart, Mula Prakriti, Muslim music, the harmony of the universe, illustration, the mystery and the appearance of Buddha, on and on. And we're still just in the slice of the M's. So the idea is that a vast scope that these sorts of letters covered. And so he kept all of these letters. And one of the letters in particular, which caused some sorts of problems when these actually became published as a book. One of the letters in particular speaks of the fact that these letters are not to be published, that it would not be something that would be approved by the Mahatmas who were writing these letters. And they say the reason was that they felt it would be more confusing than it would be enlightening. Because one of the things that comes across when you actually look at these is the fact that they are letters. And so as letters, you know, when we write to each other, it's something that has a very personal aspect to it. You know, it talks about issues that are going on with the people that you're writing to. And so it personalizes it in a way. But then also there's this very deep sort of wisdom teaching that's involved in there. So anyway, these letters, at one point when Sinnett asked whether these could be published, and he got the response that they were not to be published, during his lifetime, they weren't. But when he died, his executor felt that, you know, whether or not this particular letter sort of advised against their publication, she felt that given the state of the Theosophical Society at that time, where, you know, a lot of these sort of core ideas were going in very strange directions, that it would be worth it to go ahead and just publish these letters and allow the world at large to make their own opinions about it. So that's how these came to be. And the fellow who did all of the initial work, Trevor Barker, at that time he was a young person, and he had sort of a little bit of a problem. Because for a long time, you know, I know when I first came to the Theosophical Society, the Mahatma Letters was, as it is now, one of the foundational texts in terms of trying to learn the deeper aspects of this thing we call theosophy. But it was also difficult to read in many ways, because it wasn't chronological, which is to say a letter that came in today and spoke about an issue today that was then continued in the letter that came in the day after. You didn't have that, because they really didn't know what the chronology was. So what the guy had to do, Barker had to do, was just put it into categories. So, you know, one category was the one that kind of related to a book that Sinnett did write, The Occult World, which was based on these particular letters. So those letters, it was very easy to know the approximate time that they were received. But then the others, he had to group into categories on probation and chelaship, on the philosophical sorts of commentaries. Fortunately, you know, over time, there have been many, many people who have researched these letters very, very deeply. Particularly here in the U.S., she used to live here at headquarters for many, many years, Virginia Hansen, who was this petite little lady, but she was absolutely wonderful in terms of her study and her devotion to and the way she lived these teachings. But she was able to put together a really definitive chronology. You know, she spent a lifetime developing this. And out of that, they were able to say that with as much certainty as you can, they're able to assign dates to many of these letters. So, you know, 1993, this book came out in the Philippines first. And then, you know, ever since then, this has been like the definitive text. And it makes the reading of it much, much easier. I would recommend, too, for anyone who has a real interest in the Mahatma Letters, without even having to approach it as a philosophical or a metaphysical study, Virginia Hansen, during her lifetime, wrote a wonderful book. I mean, if you like novels, she wrote a book that was called Masters and Men. And really, it was the story of how these letters were received and the people involved in it. And, you know, she sort of fictionalized the account of how the people responded and what they thought, when the letters were received. But every aspect of it historically was true. So, I mean, you read this book and you can get an awfully good sense of what was happening and some of the meaning of these letters just in a fictional account. I mean, nobody gets murdered and you don't have to figure out who done it, but otherwise it's a very good book. So that's sort of how these letters came to be. And so in thinking about how I might approach with you all, the Mahatma letters tonight, as I tried to show you, the scope of them is vast. So what do you say? Do you talk about rounds and races, and do you talk about fohat, and do you try to get a little bit of all of it? So what I thought we'd do, and I think it might be instructive as well as fun, is to take just one thread, one particular thread that runs through the Mahatma letters, and try to kind of flesh it out from the letters themselves. And that particular thread would be what I would consider to be the kind of impulse for the writing of these letters in the first place. Which is to say that Sinnett, from the very beginning, wrote to the Mahatmas because he wanted to deepen his knowledge. And of course, like all of us, Sinnett had a particular idea of what he meant when he said knowledge. I mean, we all kind of think we know what we're talking about when we say things. I mean, it's, they always talk about people who get married and it's like they say, I do, but they really don't know what they're getting into. And then you kind of figure it out, and you find out that your early ideas of what you were going into maybe don't quite fit what it actually came out to be. It might be better, it might be worse, but it's certainly more expansive. And such was the case with Sinnett. To our minds, we have this idea, and it's sort of a phrase in our parlance. When we speak about knowledge, it's very common to hear people say that knowledge is power. I mean, probably at some point we've either heard that or said it ourselves. And when we say something like that, generally what we're talking about is, that the person who knows how to build a bridge, has a certain sort of power, or the person who knows how to, develop an atom bomb, there's power in that. Or the person who knows how to, manipulate figures, has a certain power in the workplace or a power in terms of their ability to manipulate others or whatever it is. And that's a particular type of knowledge. But what I think we'll find as we go into this is that knowledge is really something quite different than that. There's a Sufi story, and then we can start with the actual Mahatma letters, that, just in part, it really talks about the person who brought fire to human beings. And it talks about a time when nobody knew what fire was. And so this one person discovered how to create a fire. And in his desire to help humanity, he said, well, this is wonderful. I'm going to take this out to the world and show them about fire. So he did that. So the first little town he came to, he showed them how to strike this little flint and set something afire. And it was absolutely incredible. They'd never seen anything like it. And, so he left. And those people, after he had gone, all they could do was talk about it. And, around this wondrous occurrence, they developed a whole religious practice. And, they worshipped. They built a statue of him. And they all would worship the statue. Everybody was still in the dark. And nobody was using fire. But he was worshipped. The next place he goes to, he does the same thing, and the people, it's wonderful. And they develop a religion around this being who suddenly appeared and had these magical powers to bring light. And so that was the foundation of their religion. The third group he went to, he struck the fire. It struck fear in the hearts of everyone. They decided that this was something that was beyond their scope. They killed him. But they kept the flint, you know, and the little... And so their religion developed around... Once a year they would come out and they would bring this flint and they would parade it through the streets. And all would bow down, but nobody was using fire. And so the sort of relativity of this knowledge is something that, you know, that story speaks to, and sort of way that we have a habit of missing the point. So I think what we'll do now, I'd just like to share, you know, just go through, I've marked a couple of things where we're just going to talk about the Mahatmas and try and get a better idea of what it is that they are talking about when they speak about knowledge. So it's really the second letter that was received by Sinnett. This is just the answer to the Mahatma to A.P. Sinnett. And he says, your desire is to be brought to communicate with one of us directly without the agency of HPB. Your idea would be, as I understand it, to obtain such communications either by letters or by audible words, so as to be guided by one of us in the management and principally in the instruction of the society. You seek all this, and yet, as you say yourself, until now you have not found, quote, sufficient reasons to even give up your modes of life directly hostile to such modes of communication. This is hardly reasonable. So, Sinnett wants knowledge, as we all do. But in this second letter to A.P. Sinnett, the Mahatma's response is, yes, I see what you want. But what is it that you're willing to give? You know, in his letter, you know, Sinnett had apparently written that, you know, I want this knowledge, and I specifically want it so that I can be a great teacher to others. But in return, my modes of life, I'm not willing to change. And, you know, in the traditional thinking that had crept into the Western mind and probably is resident in our own minds, you know, knowledge isn't something we're supposed to have to pay for. You know, we live right now in an information age. And so we feel as if it's something that is free to all, and I don't have to change to get it. And the response very, very early on is, you know, that's not quite the way this particular game works. And he goes on to say, the first and chief consideration in determining us to accept or reject your offer lies in the inner motive, and this is a very important idea, the inner motive which propels you to seek our instructions. He says, if I may define your motives in a general aspect, they are, one, the desire to receive positive and unimpeachable proofs that there really are forces in nature of which science knows nothing. Two, the hope to appropriate them someday, and the sooner the better, for you do not like to wait, so as to enable yourself, A, to demonstrate their existence to a few chosen Western minds, and B, to contemplate future life as an objective reality built upon the rock of knowledge. And finally, to learn, and most important, this among all your motives, the whole truth about our lodges and ourself. To our minds, these motives, sincere and worthy of every serious consideration from the worldly standpoint, appear selfish. So that's their first statement about our, you know, it was written to Sinnett, but obviously if we're going to get any sort of benefit from these sorts of writings, we have to kind of put ourselves in Sinnett's place in many ways. And so what is being said at the outset is that motive is really all important. And so obviously a sort of sense of what our motivation is becomes a very key thing in terms of our approach, not just to the Mahatma letters, but to what we might describe as our spiritual life and wisdom in general. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, what in fact is our motivation. Most people would love to be prominent teachers. Often we balk at being not so prominent students. And that's sort of if we're really, really good, then we might be able to have the blessing of having an open enough mind to actually be an adequate sort of student. And I think that's what's trying to be communicated in that particular letter. So he goes on to describe the nature of their knowledge. And he says, our knowledge will not pass away from the sight of man. It doesn't pass away from the sight of man. And he says, you so love mankind, you say, that were not your generation, if your generation were not to benefit by it, you would reject knowledge itself. So their knowledge is not something that's fleeting. Probably, if you look at the history of what we regard as our highest form of knowledge, which today would be, we would tend to categorize it as the scientific sorts of methodology and the scientific sort of knowledge that we hold to. But you look back over its couple of 100-year history, and you find that probably almost every aspect of it has changed at some point. You know, at one point the earth was flat and it became round. At another point the earth was the center of the universe and it became evident that that was not the case. And on and on. You know. At one point the atom was the finite particle of matter, irreducible. And now, of course, we know that the atom has infinite sorts of levels of reduction. But it's something that is constantly being updated, being changed. According to what this is said here, it's not something that passes out of the sight of man. So it doesn't change in that way, but more so our understanding of it changes. They describe the particular knowledge that the Mahatmas concerned themselves with and what they were trying to inculcate in humanity at that time as the great knowledge. And what they say in this next item about knowledge is that once a person is fairly started on the way to the great knowledge, to doubt is to risk insanity. To come to a dead stop is to fall, to recede is to tumble backward, headlong into the abyss. And so, obviously, that's not something that's talking about whatever the latest sort of scientific theory we've embraced might be. It's talking about something else, and there's a name for that. In another letter, they talk about the real knowledge here spoken is not a mental, but a spiritual state, implying full union between the knower and the known. So the knowledge here is being defined not as something that we can grasp in any sort of intellectual way, but something that somehow has to be realized, the union between the knower and the known. And the name for this particular knowledge that Blavatsky and that the Mahatmas spoke about was called Atma Vidya. Vidya is the word for knowledge. And of course, Atma, just like when we talk about the Mahatma, Atma speaks about the highest levels of the human being, the soul, you could say. HPB described Atma Vidya as soul wisdom. And so it's really not something that can in any way be intellectually grasped. And that's often one of the mistakes that we make, that in order to be influenced by this sort of great knowledge requires a change in our whole attitude. Very often, when we speak about knowledge, the word is vidya. When we speak about the opposite of knowledge, the word is avidya, not knowledge. And that word also is the synonym for what we would call ignorance. And the Buddha made a big deal out of this whole thing of ignorance. And, a lot of the teachings of the Buddha would say that the sort of primary cause of human suffering and the main reason, the main thing that prevents us from stepping out of this wheel of constant repetition of birth, old age, sickness, and dying is the fact of a sort of very deep and abiding avidya, ignorance. And to our minds, when we talk about ignorance, generally we have a very, very mistaken idea of what that means. To most of us, when we use the word, we tend to think that it means that we are somehow lacking in some specific fact, or we know the wrong set of facts. And that's the person we would say is, in a conventional sense, is ignorant. But when we talk about ignorance in this type of sense, it's something much more deep, much more profound than merely not being in possession of the right facts. What it really talks about is a completely mistaken and wrong view of absolutely everything that we see. To the point that, each one of us sitting here in our seats tends to regard ourselves as somehow some sort of separated entity. I'm clearly me, you are clearly you, and never the twain shall meet. The example given in many Eastern teachings that brings this point across about how wrongly we tend to see the world is this example of a snake in the road. Often they talk about someone walking down a country road, looking up ahead of them, and they see a snake coiled in the road. And like most of us, probably my wife more so than anybody, if she saw a snake, there would be some particular reaction that would take place. In her case, she would probably take off running completely in the opposite direction, fast. Am I right? But, most people, they see a snake and they would become very, very afraid. The adrenaline would click in. Fight or flight would be the next reaction. Because that's what we see. But they say that in that particular example, where you see the snake in the road, actually the person walking then finds out that maybe it's not a snake, but actually it's a rope coiled in the middle of the road. And so the whole reaction, the whole way that we have approached this particular thing that we have seen has been completely wrong. Where we saw a snake, it was a rope. Where we saw a cause of fear, it was just an object. But we couldn't see it because something had clouded our vision. And so this is the state that they say we're in, just in our normal lives. We don't see things as they are. And so this sort of Atma Vidya, the soul knowledge, is what they were trying to bring about. Now, one of the things that they spoke about in these letters, it's all great to describe what knowledge is, but then how do you come to this sort of knowledge? And so they have some very specific things that they talk about in terms of the means. First, they say that illumination has to come from inside. But then they describe the means to an end, and that all that they can do is to direct the use of such means that have been empirically found by the experience of ages to conduce to the required object, so to conduce to the opening of our understanding. And so what are those things? And these are not things that are unfamiliar to all of us. Fasting, meditation, chastity of thought and word and deed, silence for certain periods of time, to enable nature herself to speak to him who comes to her for information. So, meditation and silence. Government of the animal passions and impulses, utter unselfishness of intention, the use of certain incense and fumigations for physiological purposes, have been published as the means since the days of Plato and Iamblichus in the West, and since far earlier time of the Indian rishis. So these are ways that we, first of all, kind of condition ourselves to become receptive to some sort of deeper level of knowledge. Fasting. So by fasting, at a minimum, becoming conscious of the way that we approach our appetites is one way that they're suggesting. Meditation, silence, not just sitting on a cushion, but silence, so that nature can speak to you to reveal the information that you seek. Nature herself will speak to him who comes to her for information. So, this is something that, these are simple things, but that doesn't mean that they're easy things. And they're sort of outlining this as a pathway to knowledge. Then they say, then knowledge can only be communicated gradually, and some of the highest secrets, if actually formulated even in your well-prepared ear, might sound to you as insane gibberish, notwithstanding the certainty, notwithstanding all the sincerity of your present assurance that absolute trust defies misunderstanding, which was, he's quoting Sinnett's words, that if you really trust, you cannot misunderstand. And I often think Einstein, he had something to say about this misunderstanding. He said, you have to make everything simple. But he said, there is nothing so simple that it cannot be misunderstood. We can't make it simple enough for one of us to just not get it. And this is what they're talking about. And that to give more knowledge to a person than he's fitted to receive is a dangerous experiment. And probably all of us have seen that. I know myself, I had, at one point I had the good fortune to be among a number of people who were actually studying with someone who was a deeply spiritual man. And there were a number of us who were there, and there was one person who was really one of these wide-awake, sort of prominent people, and he seemed to soak things up. We used to call the fellow the old man, and whatever the old man would say, Chris somehow had a way of, seemed like he got it. And it got to the point where he felt like he had gotten enough. He was about 26 years old, not 24 then. And so he decided it's time for him to go out and get some students of his own. And so he did that. I remember Chris would come by and he'd have, 2 or 3 of his followers. And probably, anyone who has studied a minimal amount of theosophy would have no difficulty, if that's what you wanted to do, developing a following. It's one of the easiest things to do. In the south side of Chicago, there used to be a whole area that was just full of churches. You had just one church after another, and everyone had a little following. Maybe 5 people, maybe 25 people, but it's not hard to do. But Chris had a following, and he would tell them, and people would come to him for counseling. And I remember not seeing Chris for quite a while. And when he came back, you could tell something had happened. Whereas before he had he was just filled with this sort of pride. of his knowledge, he came in the door kind of dragging his tail. And it turns out what had happened is one of Chris's students, he had given him some sort of meditative advice for some particular problem that he was having. And then it turns out, following Chris's advice perhaps didn't relieve the problem. He ended up committing suicide. And that's a tough one to kind of take off your shoulders. I mean, obviously, it's not something that he did. But in his youthful enthusiasm to quickly become a teacher and rather than to fully learn, you know, he found himself in a position where at the minimum he was unable to help this person. So, you know, we're kind of advised that, you know, there is a way that we can become open. And basically what they're talking about in those means is a system of purification, of kind of letting go of some of those things that become obstacles and opening up to other qualities that we have within. So, why do you get this knowledge and what's it for? The only object to be striven for is the amelioration of the condition of man by the spread of truth suited to the various stages of his development and of that country he inhabits and belongs to. So, you know, we could say that knowledge is knowledge, but obviously, if I tell my 18-year-old daughter certain things, it's not going to register with her in the same way that it might with someone who's 40, 50 years old. It has to be suited to the stage that we're ready to hear. Truth has no earmark and doesn't suffer from the name under which it is promulgated. So maybe it would be best to kind of wind up some of these quotes with something that kind of speaks to one of the greatest sort of difficulties that we most certainly will encounter in our search for truth, in our attempt to deepen in our knowledge. And it's a warning of sorts. And it said, self-personality, vanity and conceit, harbored in the higher principles, are enormously more dangerous than the same defects inherent only in the lower physical nature of man. And then they say that that which is generally accumulating to find its legitimate issue only in the next rebirth of an ordinary man is quickened and fanned into existence in the chela being one who has actually become an accepted student of the master or the Mahatma. So it's quickened and fanned into existence more quickly. And especially in the presumptuous and selfish candidate who rushes in without having calculated his forces. So the idea, you know, that they're expressing here is the idea that of all the things that perhaps we might pay attention to, obviously, you know, we're here for a reason. And obviously we have some sort of sense that there is some sort of deeper knowledge that is attainable or that we can realize. So we want to pursue in that way. But at the same time, there is this potential obstacle of what's described as self-personality. In other texts, you know, the Voice of the Silence, they talk about the giant weed of self. And it's something that's, we all have it. But it's something that we really have to pay very, very close attention to. Because probably the deepest problem that any and all of us have is not just self, but this kind of wrong identification that we've developed with this kind of really illusory self that we've built up. You know, we think about ourselves in many ways, and often we admire our qualities in many ways. Many of us spend probably more time than we need, or more time than is really even effective in front of the mirror, you know. And that's just sort of like the lower aspect of it. But when we have this idea of a need for prominence, a need for recognition, a need for some sort of exaltation, and we bring those sort of things to the spiritual quest, it's something that invariably is going to cause us problems along the way. So anyway, I thought that just following this one thread, this is just one of the many threads that are within the Mahatma letters. It's an inexhaustible source of, at the minimum, hints about the ways in which we can unfold the powers latent within, about the ways in which we can actually come to understand the meaning of what's spoken of as the brotherhood of humanity. So there are countless hints and very deep sorts of information that can be built into an actual life. And in the context of this series of living theosophy, I thought that we might approach it that way. So with that, if there are any questions or if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, they would be welcome at this time.
You started out saying that the Mahatmas said, don't publish this. And I'm guessing they were probably wiser than the person who decided to publish it because they're Mahatmas.
Yeah.
So why does, do you think that that advice was just for that period of time around the late 1800s and that at some point it became okay to publish them? But how do we know, like you said, that a little bit of knowledge that's you're not ready for can be a dangerous thing? How do we know that their advice wasn't
good advice?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been well if we had followed it, you mean?
That's what I'm, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those questions that, of course, we're open to ask. But just so we know, in terms of the Mahatmas and their ability to see, they would be the first to tell you that they are not omniscient. That they're certainly not omniscient in terms of they do not direct the wills of people. And, oftentimes, even in these same letters, they write about that this experiment of trying to lift humanity through the introduction of this sort of new way of seeing was a failure. They had times when that was what they felt. So, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking in terms of this as like them as all-seeing and all-knowing. On the level of the higher sorts of levels, well, yes, then you could say that their vision is quite clear. But in terms of like the ways that we're going to respond, that's something that's always, they emphasize, is always something that's completely open to us. And as a result, it can go in many different directions. But what they thought they would do is they would make the effort. So in publishing these letters, that was a decision that some people made. And it was something that was protested by some at that time. Not because they'd seen this particular letter, because obviously it hadn't been published.
All right.
But one of the problems that many people had was that some of these people who are talked about in these letters were still alive. And they may not look good. But I think one of these things, you have to judge by the fruits. And from just my experience, I think of the theosophical literature without having the Mahatma letters, and it would be very incomplete. So, I mean, that's sort of the spirit you have to approach it with. It becomes the greatest idea that these things were published, to the extent that I'm actually able to unfold any of this, or you were able to unfold it?
Myself, I haven't been able to, and I've tried studying it a couple times, and it's a little foggy, but I've had people that did understand it explain it to me, and it was, you know, it was very helpful.
Yeah.
For a while here, we were doing a class, and people were discussing it, and there's been a lot of people, Joy, there's been a lot of people that have spent a lot of time really delving into it, so I'm not saying that I don't think it should have been published. I'm just wondering
How they go against that sort of expressly written wish.
If my teacher had told me not to do something, I probably wouldn't have done it.
See there?
But he was...
He might have been testing you.
Sin wasn't alive then anyway, so he wasn't his choice.
I would say, though, that if you... I mean, oftentimes people do have a difficulty approaching this or the secret doctrine or any of these sort of very dense texts. And one way you can approach it is by... Again, this method we did tonight was just following one particular thread. There's an index. If you have an interest in motion, matter, fohat, just only look at that and see what that brings you. Just one specific subject. You'll find that all of them kind of necessarily weave in other things, but that's a good way to kind of start with it.
Well, I had a question about other letters from the Mahatmas that are not included in this chronological work.
Yeah.
Can you speak to those a bit?
Yeah, well, there are other volumes of letters. The most prominent are two volumes that were compiled by, largely by a past president, international president of the Theosophical Society, C. Jinnarajah Dasa. The Letters of the Masters of Wisdom, and it's in 2 volumes. But then there are other letters that were received that have been compiled in other places as well. Probably, I saw some research someone had done, and I think it's in the 20s, 25 people or something that have actually received letters over that time. So there are other books. I mean, Annie Besant received letters, C.W. Leadbeater received letters, various people during Sinnott's time. Of course, A.O. Hume, who was right at the time of Sinnott, and many others actually received letters from the Mahatmas.
Any other questions for Tim?
Going once?
Tim, I like the idea of picking one topic. Knowledge is a very good one. It goes through the volume of letters. But I wanted to comment on Sinnott's early desire for knowledge, along with Alan Hume. They wanted, in the Mahatma's opinion, to form a school of magic, they put it. And I remember one comment that K.H. made in response to this, said, "No, my brother, this will never do." Yeah. Their foremost purpose, of course, was to get Hume and Sinnott to look at a bigger picture, not just how to do the tricks that they had seen HPB perform. Of course, they wanted to learn how to do this themselves, but they needed to instill in these gentlemen that the primary purpose was brotherhood. And I think that's a complementary theme that runs through the letters as well.
Yeah, yeah. And the primary reason for the existence of the Theosophical Society, to try and deepen our awareness of, first of all, what is meant by brotherhood. Obviously, it's not a band of a bunch of men who are somehow related. Brotherhood in the sense of the one life is really what it's speaking about. And much of what's in the Mahatma letters speaks about, how this sort of universe within which this one life unfolds, what's the constitution of it? It's not just peopled by human beings, but there are all sorts of levels of intelligent life that are within this universe. There is, in fact, no such thing as empty space. And they would say that in a room like this, we think of ourselves as the beings that are here, but really, one of the deeper points is to try and get some sort of grasp on our place in the universe and our place as, we think in terms of ourselves as human beings, but the deepest quality of our humanness really derives from our connection with humanity as a whole. That there is, in fact, this greater whole within which we live and move and have our being. Much like in the human body, we think of ourselves as one thing, but it's composed of trillions of other little individual lives that ignorantly participate within this, within this project that I call Tim. There are 2.5 trillion cells that are doing their little thing within my body. The advantage as human beings is that we have the capacity to become, we are self-aware, and we're able to extend that self-awareness to awareness of that within which we do participate. And so many of the hints and teachings that are in there can speed this process along if we hear it and if we actually try to understand it more deeply. One of the things that is said in the letters very, very clearly is that really almost nobody got it at the time that they were written. Nobody got it. He even said that Sinet, who wrote books based on the letters, he didn't get it. But it was the best, approach possible at the time. So we have the advantage of, 100+ years, to think that we perhaps have fleshed it out more deeply, and maybe to some extent we have, but then maybe not. And so that's one of those things that requires a constant kind of application and a constant inquisitiveness and a willingness to attempt to become more open. And that's really what these things speak about.
One thing we've learned in our study group that Pablo keeps, he's not here tonight, but he would remind us about is that when we're engaging with the material, that process of engaging with it is really the whole aim behind what the secret doctrine and HPB was trying to say through that. The process of trying to stretch ourselves to intuit or to grow inwardly was the most important aspect of having these works available to us.
Yeah. Joseph Campbell said when somebody asked him about what his form of meditation was, he said his form of meditation was underlining in the books as he read them. So this whole process of being stretched and being engaged and trying to, as you say, intuit. Read in an analytical way, you'll get something out of this. But when you have some ability to kind of perceive it from this deeper level of our own being, then it actually becomes meaningful. Because the intuition is that which sees no separation between itself and knowledge. So it talks about the knower and the known. And the fusing of those is the intuitive act that we try to engage in. And it's difficult to describe when I say try to engage in it. Just try and you'll block yourself. So, yeah, that's very well put, Maria.